The winter sky over the Ardennes hung low and heavy, swallowing sound and color until the forest became a place of shadows. In the early hours of December 16, 1944, the American lines, thin, stretched, and manned largely by inexperienced units, felt the first tremor of something far greater than a routine skirmish. Before dawn even broke, the German artillery barrage tore open the silence. Tree bursts shattered the forest canopy, raining splinters and steel. Men were thrown from their foxholes, ears ringing, lungs filled with smoke. None of it felt like the scattered resistance they had grown used to in recent months. This was different. This was organized. This was deliberate. As the shells fell, radio men scrambled to send broken reports back to battalion headquarters. Officers pressed their faces into damp map sheets, trying to make sense of the sudden impact that ricocheted across their lines. Within minutes, infantry formations from the German 6th Panzer Army pushed forward, advancing through fog and fire with a determination that stunned every American unit caught in the blast. The quiet front had exploded into a major offensive, the last massive counterstroke of a collapsing Reich. Many Allied commands farther to the north and south were trained to fall back first, regroup, and evaluate the scale of any assault before committing to movement. But along this battered American front, a very different instinct took hold. Even half-frozen and disoriented, platoon leaders shouted for machine gunners to reposition. Riflemen slammed fresh clips into their garrons. Mortar crews dragged their tubes into the mud. There was no thought of calculating odds. No order to retreat and no time to wait. The immediate reaction was simple and visceral. Counterattacked. In the chaos, small American units pushed forward in short, sharp bursts, squads rushing from ruined barns, fire teams breaking through hedgerows, tank destroyers rolling out from tree lines with engines roaring. None of these actions were coordinated at the division level, and none could promise victory. But each was an attempt to seize back even a fragment of initiative. Men were not willing to surrender ground without a fight. Every forward step, even when costing blood, forced the Germans to slow, to deploy, to reorganize, and every minute mattered. On a ridge near Lochimurgraben, an American lieutenant barely in his 20s crawled from the wreckage of his observation post and rallied what remained of his platoon. They were cold, exhausted, and outnumbered. Still, they fixed bayonets, moved down the slope, and struck at a column of German infantry attempting to secure the crossroads below. The clash lasted minutes. The Americans were pushed back, but not before forcing the Germans to halt and bring up heavy weapons. That delay, insignificant on a map, became critical hours later when reinforcements moved through the nearby valley. Across the front, similar scenes unfolded, handfuls of men refusing to abandon their positions, firing from shattered windows, dragging wounded comrades through snow, launching desperate thrusts against a force that should have overrun them in a single sweep. Officers who had long trained to defend rather than advance now found themselves ordering small, rapid counterattacks simply because the alternative was collapse, and once collapse began, it would be impossible to stop. Behind these actions lay something deeper than tactical instruction. Many of the Americans on this front had not known the long attrition of earlier war years. They were new to Europe, newly blooded, and carried a raw, stubborn confidence that made them unpredictable opponents. The German high command had assumed they would break. Instead, they fought with an urgent ferocity that disrupted every timetable laid across the German maps. As the first day unfolded, headquarters struggled to understand why scattered American formations were moving forward instead of falling back for regrouping. Reports were fragmented, chaotic, often contradictory. But a picture gradually formed. Isolated companies had bought precious minutes, isolated battalions had stalled enemy armor, isolated counterattacks had prevented breakthroughs at key junctions. The line bent, but it did not collapse. In the fading light of that first day, the battlefield fell into a tense stillness. Smoke drifted above burning vehicles. Snow carried the imprint of boots and blood. The American soldiers who had survived those first hours looked out across the darkening forest, knowing the next wave would come soon. They had held, but only barely. Their counterattacks had not stopped the German offensive, but they had slowed it just enough to change what might come next. The following morning arrived without warmth. A pale sun rose behind a sheet of ice-gray clouds, casting a dim glow over the battered American positions. Overnight, the Germans attempted to reorganize along the forest roads, expecting to continue their rapid advance toward the Meuse. Their armored columns, tigers, panthers, and half-tracks, waited behind narrow choke points carved between evergreens. But the momentum they had counted on was already slipping. The Americans had forced them to deploy early. Columns that should have driven 20 miles on the first day had barely moved half that distance. Armored commanders cursed into frozen radios as engineers cleared wreckage, removed mines, and searched for alternate paths around blown bridges. Each delay multiplied the pressure. The offensive depended on speed. The Americans had taken that away, yet at the front line, the soldiers who created those delays felt no sense of strategic accomplishment. They felt only the weight of exhaustion. Many had fired their last mortar rounds. Many had only a handful of grenades. Ammunition trucks, lost or destroyed, could no longer reach them. But still they prepared to move once more, not backward, but forward. Outside the village of Hosingen, a company that had been reduced to fewer than 40 men held the high ground overlooking the main road. They watched German units gathering for another push, far stronger than anything they could resist by staying in place. Their commander, mud-stained and hoarse from shouting over artillery, knew his men could not hold another direct assault. Retreating into the village would mean encirclement. So he made the same decision countless others along the line had made: counterattack first, force confusion. By time, they moved down the slope in silence, rifles slung tight, boots crunching into the crusted snow. When they opened fire, it was sudden and violent, short, precise bursts meant to break the German formation before it could deploy. For nearly 15 minutes they held the advantage. Then machine gun fire swept across them, cutting down men in the open. Still they pressed forward until the weight of fire became too great. They withdrew in scattered groups, leaving the Germans stalled once again, momentarily disrupted, forced to pause. Every such moment, every hesitation, every forced redeployment, echoed across the battlefield like a chain reaction. What the Germans had planned as a fast thrust turned into a grinding advance. And while American infantry fought these small, desperate actions at the front, support units far behind the lines scrambled to move engineers, artillery, and armored reinforcements toward the threatened sectors. Yet even as help moved closer, the frontline soldiers knew they fought alone. In the woods, squads that had been cut off the previous day tried to move toward friendly positions, only to encounter German patrols. Without maps, without clear communication, they relied on instinct. Some moved by night, skirting roads and following frozen creeks. Others dug in, refusing to abandon ground even though no one could confirm their position. When German forces attempted to bypass them, many of these isolated squads struck from behind, creating further confusion and fracturing the German timetable. Throughout the second day, the pattern repeated: American units launching short, sharp counterattacks, withdrawing, then counterattacking again as the enemy tried to maneuver around them. None of these actions were decisive, but all were costly, for both sides. The forest floor became littered with shattered trees, broken equipment, and the silent shapes of men who had fought with everything they had. As evening approached, snow began to fall again, soft flakes settling over the wreckage. The visibility dropped, and with it, the pace of the German advance. The Americans used the darkness to reposition small groups, tending to wounded and strengthening weak points in the line. They had no illusions about the next day. The Germans were still coming, and the weight of their armor was still immense. But after 2 days of relentless pressure, one truth was becoming clear: the Americans were not collapsing. They were not disengaging. And every counterattack, every minute stolen from the enemy, was shifting the trajectory of the battle. The forest grew quiet as night took hold. Fires smoldered. Men slept where they fell. And far behind the lines, the first major American reinforcements were finally on the move, divisions awakened by reports of the unexpected stand in the Ardennes, racing toward the front to meet the storm. The morning of the third day arrived with a brittle chill that pierced through every layer of clothing. Frost clung to the edges of abandoned foxholes. Smoke drifted over shattered barns and the skeletons of armored vehicles left burning in previous engagements. Across the Ardennes, word of stubborn American resistance had begun to reach higher headquarters. Reinforcements were on the move, units that, until this moment, had been positioned for quiet occupation duty now forced into the crucible of battle. Trains carrying fresh troops rumbled through frozen valleys. Convoys of trucks and half-tracks creaked along snow-packed roads. Officers barked orders, maps clutched in frozen hands, eyes scanning terrain they had never set foot on. They understood the urgency. Without immediate intervention, the German advance could reach the Meuse and split the Allied lines in two. Yet even as reinforcements moved, they knew the front they would join was already soaked in blood, carved from hours of desperate counterattacks by men now barely standing. On the front, small American squads were still fighting in isolation. Outnumbered and low on supplies, they had become masters of improvisation. Machine guns were repositioned from wrecked tanks. Mortars were dragged through icy mud. Explosives were jury-rigged to slow the approach of armor. Every action was a gamble, every second bought was precious. And yet, for all their courage, the weariness in their eyes was undeniable. Hands shook. Faces were streaked with soot and snow. And still, when a German patrol appeared over a ridge, they did not flinch. They counterattacked immediately. In one narrow defile near the town of Clairvaux, a single American platoon faced a German company supported by armor. Their rifles were nearly empty, ammunition boxes smashed. But the Americans surged forward, bayonets fixed, grenades lobbed from frozen hands. German officers, confident in numbers and firepower, were forced to halt, pull back, and reorganize. Tanks could not fire until infantry cleared the line. Minutes stretched into agonizing hours. And though the Americans eventually withdrew, the delay allowed another battalion of fresh troops to approach from the rear, forming a cordon that would soon stabilize the line. Farther along the front, American artillery crews, previously understrength, now received reinforcements with new guns and ammunition. The first shells from these units fell with crushing precision, targeting German advance routes, cutting roads with craters, and scattering infantry formations. Each explosion brought both a reprieve and a reminder: the battlefield was unyielding, unforgiving. Every action exacted a cost. Every second of delay, even one bought with blood and fire, could shift the course of the day. The Germans, though frustrated by these delays, were relentless. Commanders pushed forward new waves of infantry, armored vehicles, and mechanized artillery. But their timing was broken. The carefully calculated schedule, designed to sweep through the Ardennes in a matter of days, had splintered. American counterattacks had forced them into continuous redeployment, dividing their forces, and creating gaps that reinforcements could exploit. Every hour they had expected to move unopposed now became a struggle to maintain cohesion under constant, unpredictable fire. In the villages lining the front line, civilians huddled in cellars, listening to the distant roar of engines, the echo of artillery, and the cries of men in the snow. Some emerged briefly to observe the passage of soldiers, eyes wide with fear and disbelief. Houses were reduced to rubble. Streets were impassable. Yet even here, the Americans' resolve was apparent. Every counterattack, every last stand, forced the Germans to respect the ground they thought would fall easily. Ordinary men, cold, hungry, and terrified, were shaping the battle by refusing to yield. By late afternoon, the first reinforcements had reached the shattered front lines. Fresh troops moved into positions long held by exhausted veterans. Officers quickly assessed the terrain, integrated scattered squads, and prepared to extend the counterattacks. The rhythm of the battle shifted from desperate resistance to organized pressure. Yet even with this infusion of strength, the Americans did not pause. Small units continued to strike, to delay, to unsettle. No moment of respite was allowed for the German columns, and the cumulative effect became visible. Tanks that should have rolled forward unimpeded now hesitated, infantry formations were forced into hasty defensive positions, and the German timetable, once precise, was now fractured beyond repair. Night fell over the Ardennes once again, cold and silent, broken only by distant artillery and the occasional flare. Soldiers, both veteran and fresh, huddled in foxholes and ruined buildings. They tended to the wounded, shared rations, and whispered the names of those lost. Across the snow-streaked fields, the Germans regrouped, frustrated, aware that they had underestimated the Americans' determination to fight, to counterattack, and to deny them momentum. Each small action, each minute of resistance, had consequences that no map or calculation could have predicted. In the darkness, the line held, but barely. The next day promised more chaos, more confrontation, more unyielding struggle. For every counterattack launched by the Americans, a German response was prepared. For every delay bought, the stakes grew higher. And in the hearts of the men who had fought continuously for 3 days, one truth remained: victory was not guaranteed, but surrender was unthinkable. The fourth day of the Ardennes offensive dawned gray and bitterly cold. Snow crunched underfoot as the remnants of battered American units prepared for another confrontation. Exhaustion clung to every man, faces streaked with soot, frozen tears, and the grime of relentless fighting. Yet beneath the fatigue burned a stubborn, unyielding resolve. Retreat was not considered. Counterattack remained the instinctive answer, learned through 3 days of survival against a foe that had expected to crush them with ease. German officers, now aware of the broken timetable, adjusted their plans. They deployed fresh divisions to the northern sectors, seeking to encircle American positions. Their panzers prowled through the woods, engines grinding over ice-laden tracks, cutting down anything in sight. Infantry followed behind, moving cautiously through the snow-laden forest, wary of ambushes and mines. The Americans' constant, unpredictable counterattacks had taught them caution, and that caution cost time. Every hour lost here would prove decisive elsewhere. On a ridge near Buchholz, a platoon of Americans had fortified a small farmhouse. Windows were shattered, walls pocked with bullet holes. Inside, a medic worked tirelessly, tending to men who had fought since dawn the previous day. Outside, riflemen and machine gunners crouched behind snowbanks and debris, eyes scanning the treeline for any movement. At first light, a German patrol approached, lightly armored, confident, and moving fast. Without hesitation, the Americans opened fire. The sudden volley threw the Germans into chaos, forcing a temporary retreat. The Americans had bought another hour, another crucial delay. Across the front, small units replicated this tactic. Fire teams struck, withdrew, repositioned, and struck again. The Germans tried to advance in columns, expecting efficiency, expecting compliance with their meticulously drawn maps. Instead, they encountered resistance that was fluid, fragmented, yet brutally effective. Every time they pressed, Americans struck unpredictably, forcing them to reorganize under fire. Morale among German troops began to waver, the illusion of an unstoppable advance was crumbling. In the villages, the human cost became visible. Civilians, trapped between two armies, buried their dead in hurried graves. Smoke from burning buildings mingled with the cold mist, creating a haunting, surreal landscape. American soldiers passed silently, eyes meeting those of the villagers with unspoken apologies and grim determination. For many, the war had become a personal struggle, to hold ground, to protect comrades, and to survive the relentless machinery of a world at war. Meanwhile, American reinforcements continued to flow into the embattled forest. Battalion after battalion arrived, bringing much-needed artillery, ammunition, and trained soldiers. They were exhausted, many having spent weeks on the move, but they understood the stakes. They took up positions, coordinated with fragmented units, and prepared to launch larger counterattacks. For the first time, the Americans could shift from purely reactive defense to an offensive rhythm, striking not merely to delay, but to push back. The Germans recognized the change immediately. Their once precise advance became a staggered, hesitant march. Orders shouted from command vehicles collided with the reality on the ground. Tanks advanced only to be met with preset anti-tank positions. Infantry attempted flanking maneuvers but were met with entrenched squads who knew every foot of terrain. Every German move now required calculation, slowing the pace of their assault. The initiative, which had been theirs for hours, was slipping away. At the center of the line, a young lieutenant who had been thrust into command after his superior was killed, rallied his men. They were weary, their numbers depleted, but their will was intact. He led a counterattack against a small German reconnaissance force that had crept too close. They charged through snow and mud, rifles blazing, and forced the enemy to retreat. It was a small victory, tactically insignificant, but psychologically monumental. The men had proven once again that the Americans would not simply wait for the enemy to dictate the pace, they would fight, immediately and without hesitation. By evening, the battlefield had transformed. Smoke curled above demolished villages, while the snow, now gray and blood-streaked, bore witness to the fierce exchanges. American troops, reinforced and emboldened, dug in for the coming night. The Germans, frustrated and slowed by relentless counterattacks, paused to reorganize. The offensive that had begun with confident precision was now struggling under the weight of resistance. Momentum had shifted, subtly but unmistakably, and yet, the Americans knew that the fight was far from over. The Ardennes would not yield easily, and the Germans were determined to regain lost ground. Men stared across the frozen fields, listening to the echoes of artillery and distant cries. Every heartbeat carried tension. Every shadow in the trees suggested another enemy maneuver. The cost of standing firm had been immense, but the cost of failure, if even a single line broke, was unimaginable. In the cold silence of night, the soldiers waited. Not in fear, but in steely anticipation. The counterattacks had bought them hours, days, and critical space. They had changed the course of a battle they were not supposed to survive. And tomorrow, they would strike again. The fifth day in the Ardennes opened with a bitter wind slicing through the trees, carrying with it the acrid smell of smoke and the metallic tang of blood. The forest, once quiet and solemn, now throbbed with the heartbeat of battle. Small units of American soldiers, weary from days of fighting, moved with precision, instinct, and determination. Each man knew the stakes: hesitation meant death, surrender meant disaster, and the only answer was to strike first, to counterattack immediately, and to force the Germans to pay for every yard gained. Along the central ridge, the remnants of a decimated battalion prepared to engage a German column advancing toward a strategic crossroads. Mortar crews huddled behind frozen earthworks, their fingers stiff, eyes scanning the tree-line. Machine gunners crawled into concealed positions, dragging what ammunition they could carry. Officers whispered orders that would be repeated by voice and gesture in the chaos to come. There was no time for hesitation. The moment demanded action, and the men knew it. When the Germans appeared through the morning mist, confident and methodical, the Americans struck. The volley was sudden, brutal, and perfectly timed. Men fell in the snow, cries and commands blending with the roar of rifles and the staccato of machine guns. German officers shouted in frustration as formations faltered. Tanks stalled, forced to wait while infantry scrambled to neutralize anti-tank positions. Every American counterattack, however small, now held tangible consequences. They were no longer merely slowing the advance, they were shaping it, forcing the enemy to fight in ways they had not anticipated. Across the front, similar actions unfolded. Fire teams emerged from ruined farmhouses, striking isolated German units, then melting back into the trees before retaliation could crush them. Engineers detonated explosives to block roads and disrupt columns. Scouts moved along frozen creeks, flanking the enemy and reporting positions to command. The Americans were fighting in fragments, yet those fragments acted with coordination, instinctively understanding the larger rhythm of resistance. The forest itself became an ally, concealing, protecting, and amplifying their efforts. For the Germans, the cumulative effect of these counterattacks was devastating. Plans that relied on speed and surprise collapsed under the weight of constant disruption. Artillery could not move forward safely. Infantry lost cohesion. Armor could not advance without infantry clearance. Confusion spread along their lines, and with each faltering step, their commanders' confidence eroded. Meanwhile, American reinforcements, now fully engaged, pressed on from multiple directions, gradually tightening the cordon and reclaiming lost ground. In one small village, a young sergeant led his squad through shattered streets to reclaim a ruined building previously occupied by enemy troops. They cleared rooms floor by floor, throwing back German defenders with grenades and bayonets. Each step forward cost blood, yet each success amplified morale. News of these actions spread quickly along the front, reaching isolated units that had been cut off for days. Inspired, they renewed their counterattacks with fresh vigor, striking unpredictably and relentlessly. By late afternoon, the tide was visibly turning. The Germans, though still numerous and heavily armed, had lost the initiative. Their timetable, once precise and confident, now lay in ruins, replaced by reactive movements dictated by the Americans' continuous pressure. What had begun as a rapid offensive now resembled a grinding struggle, every advance bought with extraordinary cost. And yet, the Americans, despite exhaustion and dwindling supplies, refused to yield. They fought not only for ground but for survival, for comrades, for the thin thread of hope that the Ardennes could be held. Even as night fell, artillery thundered in the distance, illuminating snowfields with flashes of fire. Soldiers huddled behind rubble, tending to the wounded, reloading weapons, whispering names of friends lost, and preparing for the next wave. Fatigue pressed on every shoulder, but resolve was unbroken. The counterattacks had created opportunity. The Germans were on the defensive, and the Americans sensed that the final pressure could tip the scales, yet the battlefield offered no comfort. The cost of resistance was written everywhere, in shattered homes, in frozen craters, in the groans of the dying. Morale remained fragile. Leaders reminded themselves that survival did not guarantee victory, and victory would not come without relentless courage. The next morning would be decisive. The Americans had slowed, disrupted, and inflicted damage, but the Germans were still present, still formidable, still capable of overwhelming those who faltered. And so, under a sky heavy with smoke and snow, men whispered silent prayers, braced for the final crucible. They had fought with everything they had, turned the enemy back time and again, and yet the battle demanded more. The coming hours would test not only strength and skill but the very spirit of the soldiers who had refused to yield when all seemed lost. The sixth day dawned cold and gray, the forest and fields of the Ardennes still scarred by fire, ice, and blood. Exhausted soldiers, many having fought continuously for days, rose from snow-streaked foxholes and shattered buildings. Despite fatigue, the air was charged with determination. Each man knew the significance of the moment. The Germans had been slowed, disrupted, and forced to react, and the Americans' relentless counterattacks could now shape the outcome of the offensive. Victory would not come through retreat, but through courage, precision, and the unyielding will to fight. Across the front, coordinated counterattacks began to take form. Reinforced units moved in concert with isolated squads, creating a rhythm of offense and defense that kept the Germans off balance. Artillery rumbled from newly fortified positions, laying smoke and fire over advancing columns. Infantry surged forward from concealed approaches, firing in short, controlled bursts. Tanks and armored vehicles maneuvered through gaps cleared by anti-tank teams, striking enemy armor with deadly accuracy. The Americans, once scattered and isolated, now operated as a force transformed by experience, desperation, and determination. In one valley, a company that had spent 4 days in near isolation launched a decisive counterstrike. German troops, expecting minimal resistance, were met with sudden volleys of rifle and machine gun fire. Mortar shells slammed into their positions, scattering soldiers and immobilizing vehicles. The Americans pressed forward, reclaiming lost ground and securing a ridge that provided observation over the main road. Their success, though tactical in scale, had a strategic effect. The German advance was halted, and the initiative was definitively wrested from their grasp. Elsewhere, in the shattered villages, small American teams struck at supply convoys and communication lines, creating confusion behind enemy ranks. Engineers detonated bridges and blocked roads, forcing armored units to slow or reroute. Every delay, every disruption, compounded the Germans' losses. They had expected a swift breakthrough, yet their formations now resembled fragmented waves, forced to react to actions they could not predict. Hours of planning, months of preparation, crumbled under the continuous, immediate counterattacks of soldiers who refused to retreat. Amid the chaos, the human toll was profound. Wounded men were carried through snow and debris, medics working tirelessly in freezing conditions. Every soldier bore the strain of relentless engagement, hunger, cold, fear, but also the pride of survival and the knowledge that their actions had tangible consequences. Letters hastily written to loved ones, whispered prayers, and stolen moments of silence reflected the endurance of the human spirit amid devastation. In these fleeting instances, courage and compassion intertwined, giving meaning to every struggle on the frozen battlefield. By midday, the German offensive had lost all momentum. Columns stalled, tanks withdrew to reorganize, and infantry dug in defensively. The Americans, though exhausted, held positions that had once been under threat of overrun. Their immediate, fearless counterattacks over the past 6 days had created an unbroken chain of delays, disruption, and attrition. What had begun as an instinctive reaction to the enemy's advance had evolved into a coherent defensive strategy, a testament to the adaptability and resolve of men tested beyond endurance. The evening settled over the Ardennes, casting long shadows across a battlefield both ruined and alive with the echoes of struggle. Fires smoldered in villages, artillery boomed in the distance, and soldiers huddled in trenches and ruins, silently acknowledging the magnitude of what had been achieved. Small victories, born of instinct and courage, had become a turning point. The German offensive, once unstoppable, now faced a line that would not yield, yet even in triumph, the cost was clear. Names etched into frozen snow, the moans of the wounded, and the sight of friends lost marked the reality of war. Soldiers understood that the battle had been won not through luck, but through relentless resolve, immediate action, and the refusal to surrender ground to fear or uncertainty. Each counterattack, every split-second decision to strike first, had become a statement of defiance, a declaration that the Americans would fight on their terms, on their schedule, and with unflinching courage. As night fully descended, silence fell intermittently over the forest, broken only by distant patrols and the low hum of exhausted machinery. Men gathered around small fires, their faces reflecting both weariness and a quiet pride. The Ardennes had been tested, and through continuous counterattacks, courage, and sacrifice, the Americans had preserved the front, disrupted the enemy, and demonstrated that sometimes, immediate action is not just a tactic, it is survival itself. In the cold stillness, men understood that the battle had shaped not only the territory but the very spirit of those who had fought. Against a force that expected compliance and hesitation, they had chosen to act without pause, to counterattack relentlessly, and to write their own fate in the snow and mud of the Ardennes. Victory, measured not only in miles held but in hours gained, was the product of courage forged under fire, instinct sharpened by terror, and resolve hardened by necessity. The Ardennes had been held, and the Americans had learned that in war, the first strike, the immediate counterattack, could define the difference between collapse and survival. The story of those 6 days would be remembered as a testament to the power of will, the urgency of action, and the human capacity to endure even when all seemed lost.